I recognize the representative from the Passamaquoddy Tribe, Representative Newell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Greetings, Mr. Speaker and honorable members of the House. Delu is Rena Newell. My name is Rena Newell. Passamaquoddy. I am Passamaquoddy. Nujeo Nil Zibayig. I am from Sabayik. Passamaquoddy Lepsenti Yognil. I proudly serve as the Passamaquoddy Tribal Representative to this Maine State Legislature. Mr. Speaker, I'll begin by offering the following quote. I thank all that spoke before me. The essence of tribal sovereignty is the ability to govern and to protect the health, safety, and welfare of tribal citizens within tribal territory. Therefore, Mr. Speaker and honorable members of this House, I stand to speak in support of this important piece of legislation, LD 1626, an act implementing the recommendations of the Task Force on Changes to the Maine Indian Claim Settlement Implementing Act. Mr. Speaker and honorable members of this House, in similar fashion to words expressed by my great-great-grandfather, Lewis Mitchell, who served as a tribal representative to this body more than 135 years ago, I humbly ask each of you to receive and reflect upon my words with an open mind. I do not wish to offend, yet only to bring a voice to the subject before us. Mr. Speaker, it has taken a great deal of time to reach this historic day. When I began in my role as the tribal representative for the Passamaquoddy tribe at the start of the first session of the 129th legislature, it followed a time where little dialogue was occurring between the tribes and the state. Due to the walkout from this chamber that occurred in 2015. After receiving permission from the Joint Tribal Council to return to this designated seat within this chamber, I learned that there were many bills submitted by representatives other than myself on behalf of the Wabanaki tribes. This was, it turns out, an indication that the legislature's relationship with the Wabanaki tribes was evolving in a positive manner. An important point to make, Mr. Speaker, is that the chiefs of the Wabanaki tribes, some who are with us today, were then invited by leadership at that time to begin discussions once again. On or about April 16, 2019, tribal leaders met with state leaders. Mr. Speaker, I will remind you and this body that on June 10, 2019, a joint resolution presented during the 129th legislature was presented to support the development of mutually beneficial solutions to the conflicts arising from the interpretation of an act to implement the Maine Indian Claim Settlement and the Federal Maine Indian Claim Settlement Act of 1980. The resolution stated, "We, the members of the 129th legislature, now assembled in the first regular session, on behalf of the people we represent, take this opportunity to recognize that the Maine tribes should enjoy the same rights, privileges, powers, and immunities as all other federally recognized Indian tribes across the United States." On July 22, 2019, the first meeting of the Task Force on Changes to the Maine Indian Settlement Implementing Act began. Mr. Speaker, might I take an additional time to share from materials submitted to the task force? It is a timeline leading up to the Maine Indian Land Claim Settlement. Mr. Speaker and honorable members of the House, in 1820, Maine became a state and assumed all duties and obligations from Massachusetts arising from treaties and otherwise, and accepted monetary compensation for doing so. From 1820 to 1975, Maine exercised increasingly pervasive authority over tribes, approved by Maine courts, while the federal government failed to exercise its trust responsibility to the tribes. In 1873, the Maine legislature removed treaty obligations language from the printed Constitution. In 1892, in State v. Newell, Maine law court holds that the tribes are fully subject to state law. In 1967, Maine Indians obtained the right to vote in state elections. This was 40 years after Native Americans were granted the right to vote in federal elections by Congress. In 1968, the Governor's Task Force on Human Rights documents condition of Maine Indians. The report began with the following introduction. To be Indian in the state of Maine means, if you are on a reservation, you live in substandard housing with inadequate sanitary facilities. Your children are likely to receive such a poor elementary education that they will be almost certain to drop out of high school. But no matter how bright they are likely to be counseled away from a college education. The report further stated that non-Indigenous men can come within your communities and commit crimes of violence against you and your family with almost complete impunity, while you, as an Indigenous person, are likely to be arrested for the slightest infraction of the law and prosecuted to the hilt. Most of all, that you can be certain your problems will be studied, the study filed and forgotten until the next study, but that nothing will change very much. From 1970 to present, new federal policy adopted to promote tribal self-government, Indian Self-Determination Act, and numerous other federal laws passed to support tribal government, tribal self-government. In 1975, Passamaquoddy versus Morton holds that the Non-Intercourse Act applies to the Passamaquoddy tribe and the Penobscot Nation and recognizes the trust responsibility between the tribes and the United States. In 1976, after Morton decision becomes final, federal government acknowledges the Passamaquoddy and Penobscot tribes as federally recognized tribes. In 1979, in State versus Dana, held that the state criminal laws are not applicable to Indians on Indian lands in Maine, which are Indian country under federal Indian law. In 1979, Bottomley versus Passamaquoddy Tribe holds that the tribes in Maine have the same sovereignty as other federally recognized tribes under federal Indian law. In 1980, the Maine Indian Claim Settlement Act and the Maine Implementing Act was signed into law. Passamaquoddy, Penobscots, and Maliseets were parties. The Aroostook Band of Micmacs were not a party, but are subject to state law and listed as an other tribe. Mr. Speaker, the matter before this body is about fairness, equity, and the right of self-determination. And I wish to speak briefly to self-determination. Since 1968 to present, the overarching U.S. policy regarding federally recognized tribes has been one of promoting tribal self-determination. In this period, Indian country has seen a resurgence of tribal government activity in Congress and in the federal courts. Policies emerged that favored tribal control over their destinies. With control over their lands and resources, tribes have made great strides towards reversing the economic blight that resulted from previous federal policies and have revived their resilient and beautiful cultures, languages, and societies. Under the Self-Determination and Self-Governance Acts, tribal governments have been managing many federal programs that are intended to serve Indian people. I would correct that to say Indigenous people. Mr. Speaker, related to the tribe's right to self-determination is the right to self-govern, which is the right to pass and enforce laws on your own lands. As Indigenous people have a right to maintain and develop their own Indigenous decision-making institutions, they also have the right to participate in decision-making in matters which would affect their rights through representatives chosen by themselves in accordance with their own procedure. By fostering the active participation of Indigenous peoples, the expectation is that their rights will be protected and their culture and physical survival ensured. The Wabanaki tribes of Maine enjoy and exercise their right to participation in public affairs, and yet our right to self-govern and to pursue self-determination on our own terms is restricted by the Settlement Act. Today, in 2022, at a time when tribal nations throughout the United States are increasingly becoming leaders for rural progress in terms of government services, economic development, and environmental stewardship, the Wabanaki nations lag far behind our Indigenous brothers and sisters around the United States. We see amazing tribal-state partnerships that deliver millions of dollars every year into education, public health, and criminal justice. We see state government leaders embrace tribal leaders as friends and as trusted allies. Here in Maine, however, tribal self-determination has been much different. Instead of tribal-state partnerships aimed at giving a hand up, tribal-state relations in Maine have historically been embodied in the old Indian agent, who used to administer food, clothing, and jobs in our communities. They literally gave us handouts as opposed to a hand up. Mr. Speaker, as a young child, I cleaned the office of the Indian agent. As I stand here today, Mr. Speaker, I would state that the Indian agent mentality must no longer be supported. As we, the Wabanaki nations, seek to govern ourselves, to chart our own paths for success and self-determination. Mr. Speaker, I have heard many times throughout my time here concerns that may arise as a result of unintended consequences that are often supported to vote against proposed legislation. A quote often attributed to former President Franklin Roosevelt is that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Truer words have never been spoken when it comes to what hinders true progress in tribal-state relations here in our beloved homelands that we share. Mr. Speaker, let it be stated that the Wabanaki tribes have lived for more than 42 years to what I observe as the intended consequences of living with the limitations set forth in the Maine Implementing Act created in 1980. Mr. Speaker and honorable members of this House, the time to change this is now. For the Wabanaki tribes rightly deserve and should enjoy the same rights, privileges, powers, and immunities as other federally recognized Indian tribes within the United States. Lastly, the Wabanaki were the first to greet Europeans when they arrived in these lands hundreds of years ago. Our generosity and stewardship of these lands that we all call home, that allowed settlements to flourish in reliance on Maine's bountiful natural resources, we remain here today as the same people looking to be good neighbors and to build a brighter and stronger future for our communities. I ask all of you, my colleagues, to reflect upon these sentiments and to vote in favor of LD 1626, Nitem Sil, Chi Willie Wun, Mr. Speaker.